Hello, welcome to Civil War Digital Digest. I'm Andy, and today we're going to be talking about the Arms and Uniforms series and focusing on the Pennsylvania Bucktails, also known as the 1st Pennsylvania Rifles, 13th Pennsylvania Reserves, or the 42nd Pennsylvania Infantry. The Arms and Uniforms series on Civil War Digital Digest is our opportunity to take an in-depth look at a unit. We're not going to just look at their uniform at one quick point during the war. We're going to look at it at a variety of points. And what we want to see is the evolution of a unit. I don't want to just pick a cool unit. I want to pick a unit to look at that has a clear progression in what it wore and what it carried during the war, and to see how that affected their service and how their service affected it. I want to take time to say thank you to our patrons. It's their financial contributions that allow us to put on this quality product for you. If you're not already a patron, look below at the links and think about joining up. We'd love to have you as a patron on board. As we examine the history of the Bucktails, the first period that we're going to look at is how a soldier would have looked in June 1861. The soldier here looks pretty normal for a federal infantryman during the war, but that actually kind of speaks to how the early armies were equipped. States took the onus of equipping and uniforming their troops in the early part of the war, and Pennsylvania, as a prosperous state, followed the federal standard as much as possible. You can see here he's wearing a forage cap or kepi, a 4-button sack coat, light blue trousers cut to the federal pattern, and this is before the Federal Army switched officially from dark blue to light blue trousers. Pennsylvania, as much as possible, tried to follow the federal standard, and there's a wealth of information in their archives about what was issued to the Pennsylvania Reserve Corps. And mind you, the Pennsylvania Reserve Corps is not federal troops. They are a private state army at this point. They don't become federalized till later, so Pennsylvania was responsible for arming and equipping these men. Interestingly, as a rifle regiment, this soldier is carrying a 1816 musket converted from flintlock to percussion. Colonel Biddle and Lieutenant Colonel Kane raised this regiment as a light infantry, as a rifle regiment. And they fought to get their men rifles. And even though the men brought rifles with them, they were target rifles, civilian rifles. The state wanted to give the men a uniform weapon, and unfortunately all that was available was this smoothbore weapon. That would be a point of contention in their early service. The rest of the equipment here, the accoutrement that goes with this, supports the Model 1816, a Model 1839 cartridge box meant for round ball or bucking ball. It would carry 40 rounds. The waist belt, a 2-rivet bayonet scabbard, and a cap pouch, all of which are very normal. Same for the haversack and canteen and the knapsack. The blanket was the same style as a federal issue one, but in place of the US stitched into it would have PV for Pennsylvania Volunteer. Otherwise, though, this soldier looks very much like a standard federal soldier during the war. And of course, the distinguishing mark of the Bucktails. This regiment, by and large, was raised from frontier counties, and the companies that Colonel Kane brought to the war wanted to show a mark of their prowess as hunters and their marksmanship. And so they decided that the Bucktail badge was a great way to give an identifying mark to other troops that they were crack shots. So this soldier here is going to be how they appeared in 1861 while they're on campaign. Now we're going to look 1 year into the future and see where this regiment is. By the summer of 1862, the Bucktails are fighting in 2 different units. One battalion of 4 companies is under Lieutenant Colonel Kane in the Valley. And in June of 1862, his battalion, attached to the Flying Brigade of Cavalry, looked like this when they fought at the battles of Harrisonburg and Cross Keys during the last part of the Shenandoah Valley campaign. By this point in the war, the federal government had taken over supplying the Bucktails with their uniforms. And you can see that there's a remarkably different look to it. The hat is a 1858 forage cap, still with the Bucktail on it. The 1858 frock coat or dress coat for the Army was almost universally worn by the unit. They're still wearing sky blue trousers, which has now become the federal standard, as well as they're wearing the Army of the Potomac style gaiters or leggings. And there's some great woodcuts from the battalion when they're on campaign in the Shenandoah Valley that show them attired like this. The weapon has changed too. Now the soldiers were carrying the Model 1855 or 1861 Springfield rifle musket. Sometime in the fall of 1861, the regiment was re-equipped. And finally, they had something that was worthy of them being light troops, a rifle regiment. It's critically important to understand that the smoothbore muskets that had been issued before were only accurate out to 50 or 75 yards. But the Model 1855 rifle musket is the first mass-produced rifled arm that's given to all the soldiers of the United States Army. Using the Minet bullet, this means that it can be loaded just as quickly as a smoothbore musket, but still have the ability to reach out to several hundred yards against man-sized targets. We don't know which weapon they carried because the federal government considered the 1855 and the 1861 to be interchangeable weapons. The ordnance returns gave either as an option for it. But given when the regiment was re-equipped, so in the fall of 1861, and the limited production of Model 1861s up to that point, most likely they got Model 1855s, probably ones that were turned back in by 3 months regiments when they mustered out in the summer of 1861. The rest of the accoutrements supports this new weapon. They now have a 58 caliber cartridge box, still carrying 40 rounds, and now the appropriate belt and bayonet, scabbard, and cap box for the Model 1855. The rest of the equipment remains the same, but the soldier now is carrying less. One of the big things about the soldiers by this point is they're in a cavalry brigade. They are in a flying brigade that is marching 20, 30 miles a day, so they are cutting down their packs as much as possible. And one of the big things that makes this possible is the introduction of the shelter half. The shelter half is a French invention that was brought over to the US Army by George McClellan after his tour of Europe before the war. We know that the Pennsylvania Bucktails were issued them along with the rest of the First Corps in the early part of May of 1862 while they were stationed in Fredricksburg. The idea is that two men could button their hats together and have a tent. And instead of having to have a baggage train that follows the regiment with common tents or Sibley tents, they now can carry their own shelter with them. The other 6 companies of the regiment would have been armed and equipped the same way as the 4 companies in the valley. And so this shows how the Bucktails would have looked going into their first major campaigns during the summer of 1862. Now they're uniformed by the federal government. They look much different and they're armed much differently. Next, we're going to look ahead and see where the regiment is by the end of the year. And we see the changes that 1 year's campaigning has wrought on them. By the time of the Battle of Fredericksburg in December 1862, the Bucktails have been through some brutal combat. By this point in the war, they've equipped themselves with the weapon that they are most famous for carrying, the Sharps rifle. In August of 1862, the regiment armed itself with Model 1859 Sharps infantry rifles. The model that they acquired was the double-set version made for Colonel Bourdin. They were his spares, his extras. There weren't enough Sharps originally for every man in the regiment, and many men still continued to carry their Springfield rifle muskets. But we know that by December of 1862, the regiment was entirely equipped with Sharp rifles. We know that some of the men acquired the more common single set variant that we show here. We know that men in the regiment carried both sets. The Sharps is a skirmisher's weapon. It's a soldier's weapon. It's what the Bucktails absolutely would love to have as their weapon. It's a 54 caliber breech loading weapon, which means that you can load it while laying on the ground or kneeling very easily. You no longer have to ram a round down the barrel with a ramrod. Instead, you just open the action, you put a round in it, and you cycle it, and it loads much more quickly. Your rate of fire is increased. Your range is increased because this weapon is wonderfully accurate. The Sharps rifle was accurate out to 600-700 yards. Men who weren't just on the skirmish line, but were out actually sniping and sharpshooting loved this weapon because of how accurate it was. And it was robust and reliable. The 1855 was a great weapon. The 1861 are great weapons, but they're what every soldier carried, and it was meant for men standing in ranks and firing at other soldiers standing in ranks. For skirmishers, for men that had to be out in front of the lines, who had to be much smarter and faster, who looked for cover and concealment. This was the kind of weapon. This was, for the summer of 1862, this was the best weapon that was available in North America for these soldiers to have. The rest of the uniform for the soldier hasn't changed much. You can see that after a year's campaigning, he's lost the gaiters. We do know from pictures taken during this time that soldiers by and large are still wearing the frock coat. They're still generally wearing the forage cap as well, of course with their distinguishing mark of the bucktail on there. The rest of the equipment remains the same. It reflects that these soldiers have now seen 6 months of hard combat, hard marching and campaigning, and they have now earned a reputation on the battlefield. These soldiers went into some of the toughest fighting of the war at Fredricksburg and Gettysburg, looking and armed and equipped just like this. And these are some of the places that the Pennsylvania Bucktails really made their legend known. Next, we're going to see how the regiment looked at the end of its service, in the summer of 1864, right before it mustered out. By the spring of 1864, the Bucktails were getting down to their last couple weeks of service. But those were going to be hard weeks for them, going through the Overland Campaign, through the wilderness, Spotsylvania, and finally finishing up at Bethesda Church outside of Richmond. The Bucktails by this point are veteran soldiers. They had proved themselves as outstanding skirmishers, as one of the finest bodies of light troops during the war. And the soldiers by this point reflected the hard service they had been through and the lessons they had learned along the way. Right away, you should notice the big change in the Bucktails going into 1864 is the weapon. Their trusty Sharps rifles are gone, the weapon they carried in Antietam and Fredericksburg and Gettysburg. In its place is the .52 caliber model 1860 Spencer infantry rifle. The Spencer was one of the revolutionary weapons of the Civil War. It fired a metallic cartridge which was impervious to water, carried 7 shots in the butt of the rifle, and allowed for rapid fire of the weapon. It still could be loaded while lying down or in the kneeling position. However, the weapon had drawbacks, and it wasn't as popular with the Bucktails as you might think it was. The regimental history actually records that a lot of the men were very upset to have to turn in their Sharps, and a lot of them tried to secret their weapons back home. The Spencer had some drawbacks. It wasn't as accurate out to the range of a Sharps rifle. It was a more underpowered round. It was a round really only designed to go out to 200 or 300 yards. It wasn't meant for that long-range sniping that the Sharp was capable of. The Bucktails were a rifle regiment, and we talk about them being sharpshooters, but in the context of the Civil War, sharpshooter means light infantry. It doesn't mean sniper. These men are not going and doing 800-900 yard shots as a normal day. They're going out there on the skirmish line and they're firing at other enemy skirmishers at 100 to 200 yards. So this kind of weapon had some great advantages over the Sharps. The Spencer did have the ability to put more lead down range quickly in the engagement ranges that these soldiers were fighting at, 100 to 200 yards. But it also was less reliable. It was finicky. It was more complex of a mechanism than the Sharps. The Sharps was reliable and the soldiers loved it. But the Spencer turned out to be one of the weapons of the war that really made a name for itself in this last year. It was new, and soldiers are always a little bit afraid of new weapons. This weapon, though, it went on most Union sharpshooters by the end of the war equipped with it. It ended up surpassing the Sharps, and it should be no surprise that this is what the Bucktails carried their last couple months. You can see the uniform is different too. By the spring of 1864, the soldiers have largely equipped themselves with private purchase sack coats. These sack coats are not cut to the Army pattern. They were longer on average. A lot of times they had extra pockets or buttons that the Army sack coats didn't have. Also, the pictures for 1864 show that these men, by and large, are wearing civilian hats by this point. Still with bucktails on them, but now they have a more utilitarian hat, something that gives cover all the way around the head. Furthermore, we see that this soldier is wearing boots, not just booties, not the infantry shoes. This was a more practical thing for a soldier to wear on campaign, especially crossing streams or any kind of water feature. It kept their feet dry longer. The pictures that we see from the Bucktails going into this campaign show a lot of them are wearing these kind of boots, and that's why we're showing that here today. Furthermore, you can see on this soldier that he's wearing a corps badge on his left breast. In the spring of 1863, the Army of the Potomac instituted a system of corps badges. Each corps had a different shape and each division had a different color. When the Bucktails rejoined the Army of the Potomac on the Gettysburg campaign, they became part of the 3rd Division, 5th Corps. And that's what this soldier with his blue Maltese cross is showing here. The Bucktails continued to fight in this division through the end of their service in May 1864. Lastly, you can see the soldiers carrying a blanket roll in place of a knapsack. While we don't know for sure what every single soldier of the Bucktails carried, we do know that these were veteran light infantrymen going into their last campaign of the war. We know that they learned the value of carrying less, of traveling lightly. And the Overland Campaign gave very little opportunity for soldiers to get into their packs. Many of these men went for 30 days wearing the same clothes and their equipment and sleeping on their arms every night. And having a blanket that was easily accessible, where it could be unrolled and wrapped up in the middle of the night, is something that soldiers would have done on the Overland Campaign. So now we've seen the Pennsylvania Bucktails, the 1st Rifles, through 4 different periods of their service during the Civil War. We've seen some phenomenal changes. They've carried 4 different kinds of weapons. Their uniforms have been supplied by the state and then the federal government, and then largely self-equipped by the soldiers by the end of the war, as they wanted to find things that were more comfortable. This regiment was one of the most famous light infantry regiments of the Civil War, and they made a name for themselves. But they made a name for themselves partly because of what they carried. It's important for us to understand that what they carried changed and influenced and allowed them to gain that reputation. I hope you've enjoyed this look at the Pennsylvania Bucktails here on Arms and Uniforms on Civil War Digital Digest. I want to say thanks to Ron Palm and his museum for providing images for us today. I'm Andy Roscoe, and we'll catch you next time.